So hello and welcome to another one of the NodeConf EU Fireside Chats. I'm Katie Roberts from the BBC and I'm here with Danese Cooper from NearForm.
Hey Katie, how you doing?
It's really great to see you again,
yeah,
Danese.
It's good to see you too.
I was wondering if you can start by just introducing yourself a little.
Well, let's see, my name is Danese Cooper. I've been working in tech since the early 90s, and first for proprietary companies. But I started working for Sun Microsystems in 1999 with the job of open sourcing Java. And that brought me into the open source world. I've had some famous jobs. I was the CTO of Wikipedia for a little while. I've been involved in some famous projects like OpenOffice when I was at Sun, and really all of Sun's open source projects, but that one had the biggest audience, so everybody knows it. And we did eventually get Java, code released under an open source license, which was good. Unfortunately, right before it became the property of a company that doesn't understand open source. But anyway, I've been around a while, and I joined NearForm about a year ago.
Yeah, looking at your LinkedIn profile, your CV basically reads like a who's who of tech companies.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
It is. I have been so lucky, and it's not fashionable for women to admit that there's luck in the mix. People say that luck favors the prepared, and I did work my little fanny off, but I also was in the right place at the right time more than once.
So we first met at NodeConf back in 2015,
yes,
where you spoke very eloquently about the Node.js Foundation that had just been established.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So Node existed, this is its 10th anniversary, so it had been around a few years by 2015. But the main creators of Node were impatient with the actions of the trademark holder, which was Joyent, and they forked Node. And they did it right at the moment that Node was starting to really gain momentum as a general tool, general purpose framework for JavaScript. And they really risked the future use of Node. They sort of didn't understand how branding works in the minds of consumers. And there was a guy named Michael Rogers who was very involved in Node at that point. He came and found me at an O'Reilly event, invitational conference called FooCamp, and asked me about copyright and how copyright assignment works, because Joyent had just done something about copyright that most of the community didn't agree with, although Joyent was, I think, trying to do the right thing. Brian Cantrell came up with this idea that they should do away with copyright assignment because that would make people happier. What people weren't happy about was being told what would make them happier. Yeah. And so it precipitated a fork. When I first got involved in open source in the early 90s, Tim O'Reilly was fixing a fork, helping to fix a fork in the Perl community. And I always thought it was so cool that he stepped in and helped out. So when I got invited to a meeting IBM was hosting with basically the whole Node community leadership, I went. And Brian was there, various other people were there. And it was really clear to me that they were shooting their toes off one at a time as regards the popularity of the project, and we needed to do something drastic. Yeah. So we renegotiated with them. We got the IOJS fork people to rejoin with the Node people, which were mostly company-owned engineering resources, to get the greater message of the Node framework to move in the right direction again. And we founded a foundation under the Linux Foundation umbrella, because that made Joyent the most comfortable as trademark holder. And I was the first chairperson of that foundation for 2 years. And then I served on the board one additional year as well. Of course, now it's been merged with what was the jQuery Foundation into something called the JavaScript Foundation. And I think that's a good move over at Linux Foundation, because they were competing for the same sponsorship dollars, which was getting in the way. Yeah. But some of the early stuff we talked about when we first met to talk about the Node Foundation was the extent to which we needed a compatibility test kit, essentially, for practitioners, something that would certify practitioners as knowing what they were doing with Node. Because as powerful as Node framework is at making JavaScript really work well at scale, it's also possible to write yourself into a corner. And figuring out how to find resources that were well tested and able to do the right things was one of the very first things that we thought was important. And of course, that work just happened this year, finally released to the public through a work between NodeSource and my company NearForm to create this way that you can, as a Node developer, prove that you are a good Node developer. It's pretty great.
Yeah, so this is the certification.
Yeah. So people always ask, what does the foundation do for me? And for the average Node developer, not a lot. The truth is, Node kind of exists around the fact of the foundation or through it, you know. But things like this organization, this is the kind of thing that the community wasn't going to get off the ground on their own, that is really needed to continue the growth of the framework. So.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Yeah, it was good work, and I can say now that I helped heal a fork too, you know.
No, that's brilliant. Another thing that you spoke about at the conference when I first saw you, which I found incredibly inspirational, was your love of open source. Could you talk to me a little bit about that?
Sure. So I worked for Apple. I worked on the underlying technology that's used in applications like FaceTime. It happened a long time before there was a phone. And when Steve came back to save Apple, we lost our jobs because he couldn't turn the thing that we had done into a product yet. He had to save the company first. Yeah. And he actually, that was communicated to us, and a number of people went back to Apple when he was finally ready to do that. But in the meantime, we all had to find other jobs. Yeah. Well, for me, I had been very frustrated as an executive of that group, you know, somebody managing engineers, that we were being locked out of our own code trees due to internal politics within the QuickTime team. And it was really inefficient. And I kept thinking, God, there's got to be a better way to do this. So my next job, I went to work at Symantec, and my job was to teach them how Apple up the street ran its engineering organization. And so we started a practice of engineering program management within that company. And at the time, I had the opportunity to run things in a more open way, at least within the company. And it was like magic. It was brilliant. So one day I was sitting in a restaurant in Cupertino across the street from Apple with an old ex-Apple colleague having lunch, and it was sort of a late lunch. We were really there to bitch about our new employers. And we're having this conversation, we're drinking a lot of sake, and it was tiny, tiny little sushi bar. It used to be a dentist's office, so it has like 6 tables. And this woman came over and she said, excuse me, I couldn't help but overhear your conversation, and I was wondering if you'd like to open source Java. And I went outside and called my husband and said, do I want to open source Java? And he said, yeah, you want to do that. I said, why do I want to do that? And he said, well, because they're going to get it wrong, and my work is kind of dependent on what they do there, and you're really stubborn. You probably make them do it right eventually. So, but at the time, I wasn't even all that clear about what it meant, you know, and so I went off to Sun to open source Java. And what I found was that I was probably born to work in that community because, you know, it's about collaboration and sharing and transparency and all the things that I have a hard time keeping tamped down when I'm working in a more proprietary setting. Like, I always thought it was so weird. You could get fired at Apple for telling somebody else that worked for the same company what you were working on over lunch, like an extreme level of lockdown of information. I think that they continue to work that way is almost the exception that proves the rule. Like, it's a lot of heavy lifting. Yeah. If they weren't the richest company in technology most years, it would be sad. I mean, at least they're able to pull it off. Mm-hmm. But open source represents more trust between parties, more willingness to share and see all the boats rise. Mm-hmm. I loved this. Yeah. So shortly after I joined Sun, about 6 months in, I quit. And the reason I quit was because Sun wasn't really open sourcing Java. And I was really tired of being, you know, the scapegoat for the open source community being so angry at Sun for not getting it right. And so I quit. And it was 0.5% unemployment in Silicon Valley the day that I quit. And I figured that I would be able to get another job pretty easily, but it never occurred to me that they wouldn't be able to let me go because they couldn't replace me, right? So yeah. I got the famous "what would keep you here" question, and my answer was, and if you ever get this question, you have to aim high, okay? I said, well, I think you've pissed off everybody in the open source world, and I don't think you meant to, but it happened. You're going to need to be friends with them. It's clear. And so I think you should let me be their friend on your behalf, because they trust me. And then as we go along, you know, we'll be able to leverage that relationship to get some good things to happen. And they said, well, that sounds like a good idea. What would your title be? And I said, Chief Open Source Evangelist. And they went, great. So that gave me access to Scott and, you know, basically the leadership of the company. And it also gave me an opportunity, because Java was the great, you know, low-hanging fruit of open source. It gave me the opportunity to make friends with pretty much everybody in the leadership of open source at that point. And we very quickly started doing projects that were really open source and really interesting to people, like Apache Tomcat, for instance, right? Which, you know, both strategically met the goals that Sun set for it, and also, you know, the community loved it and picked it up and used it and ran with it. Made all the engineers that worked on it famous. Like, it did everything right. And so I got very attached to that movement. Fast forward to, I think it was 4 years later, I was drafted onto the board of the OSI. And that was in recognition of work that I had done on projects that weren't Java, because Java wasn't open yet still, nor was Solaris. But we were getting lots of other stuff open that was useful to people. And the Open Office project, of course, was a big milestone, because it enabled a better desktop, and it provisioned GNOME as a GUI for all Unixes. And there were lots of things that were good about that project. So now I'm in charge of sort of defending what open source is. Yeah. And at the time, there were only 5 of us on the board, but we grew the board while I was there. I was there for a decade. We started making sure we had covered the whole world. You know, we put Indians and Africans on the board to get a broader perspective about what open source means when you're not from a rich country. We brought an equal number of women and men onto the board, because I was the first woman and it was lonely. Yeah. So running around the world telling people what open source could bring them, the big message is all the boats have to rise. It's about technology being better for everybody. Yeah. We were constantly hearing, well, that's great, but how can I keep my neighbor to the north, south, east, or west of me, who I hate, from getting the same advantage? I'm like, man, that has no place in open source. Open source is about everybody winning. And at the time, the likelihood that we were going to survive, you know, the attempts by Microsoft and others to kill us, well, there was no guarantee that we were going to prevail. So to be here on the other side of 20 years of work and have everybody universally know that open source has been this huge enabler for innovation and you know, the great leap forward almost in availability of world-class software, and a bit of the closing of the digital divide due to projects like OpenOffice is pretty great. No, it's pretty great.
It really is amazing, and yeah. I think that the work that my teams do at the BBC and the people that I'm involved with, the amount of open source software we use now, it's just phenomenal, and having access to those hive minds who have built this amazing stuff, yeah. It's just fantastic, it's phenomenal.
It is.
Thank you.
Oh, well, it wasn't just me. You know,
oh, no, thank you all.
Yeah, we should thank everybody, because it was a lot of people working pretty hard.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So, now you're at NearForm.
Yes.
What have you been brought into NearForm to do?
Well, I was working for PayPal 5 years ago and came to the realization one day that the reason that they weren't getting good outcomes from open source was because they didn't understand how to collaborate inside the company because of the way that the culture was set up. There were, of course, exceptions. I'm not saying that nobody ever collaborated at PayPal, but it was hard to do. There were lots of institutional reasons not to collaborate. They had silos set up. They represented areas of specialization. There was a lot of chauvinism between silos, like I know more than you know, or those kinds of human things that happen everywhere, right? And so I knew that InnerSource existed because I've been doing this forever. I remember Tim O'Reilly and Brian Bellendorf talking about InnerSource as, you know, using open source methods inside to get some of the same outcomes, but just inside your company. And they couldn't sell that 20 years ago because open source hadn't won yet. And so people wouldn't, it was too easy for naysayers to say that's not going to happen. But now it's unequivocally a goodness, open source. And so companies 20 years later are even more siloed, even less able to deal with their own bottlenecks. And teaching them how to collaborate seems like the next great work to me. You know, as a person who's grateful for a career that I had no right to. I mean, my degree's in French literature, you know, I learned this on the job, right? It's been such a good life for me, but I think we're only scratching the surface of people who actually know how to work in a collaborative way. Yeah. There's lots and lots of people who use open source, but most of them don't know how to get their contributions back upstream. So we always tell them to contribute upstream, but we don't tell them how. And this is a way for people to clean up the engineering inside their company so that they'll be better contributors outside.
So it gives them the confidence from working in a world that they understand already, where they've already got that kudos, that understanding of what's going on.
Exactly.
Get to that sort of level of ability to contribute to somebody else's code, and it's a small elite to contributing to open source.
Precisely, but it also makes it possible for firms like yours to hire people who already know how to collaborate, so you don't have to keep teaching it to them, you know? Yeah. It's not taught in school yet. So I have a plan of how to, you know, tackle this problem that everybody's being taught the other way to engineer. And I mean the social part of engineering, not the mechanics of engineering are what they are, and as tools change and get more popular, like GitHub now is teaching people, you know, sort of the flow of how we work. But most people who acquire GitHub Enterprise will try to set it up like the previous code management system they had, you know, with all the same fences and for security or for some other reason that's just really their comfort with lack of change, right? So there's the tooling that changes, and we're lucky that right now we have distributed code management tooling that happens to fit the way we work. But there's more to it. There's, you know, thinking about how somebody's going to receive what you're sending. There's thinking about how to mentor somebody through what they don't know because nobody ever wrote it down yet. There's just lots and lots of things that if you learn them first inside your environs, you're going to do a better job of doing it outside. Yeah. So.
Okay, so we talked about inner source and an inner source community that you're building now.
Well, the same day that I realized that we needed to do inner source was the day that I realized that probably we were not alone. And using every lesson I ever got in helping open source grow, I set up a nonprofit. It was meant to be a nonprofit. At the time, it was owned wholly by PayPal, but we're just now in the process of separating it really truly from PayPal. We grew a reasonably strong community of companies that are doing experiments in inner source so that they could share and fail faster, and we could all come to an understanding faster. And it's really attracted some interesting people who want to change the inside of their company to be more efficient. They come for different reasons, but they have some similar characteristics, which they've kind of inherited from the existence of open source. So it's interesting to see the culture change on its own, you know, and then we're just there to try to help as people stumble onto the concept. We're there to catch them. We run summits where they get to meet each other. We have various working groups. We have a working group that's been working on tutorials. PayPal paid O'Reilly to produce 4 video tutorials of the 3 roles that are most prominent in inner source, plus sort of a executive level briefing on what inner source is. And we did those because when we were rolling this idea out at PayPal, we saw what we like to call brand dilution, where it showed up on everybody's business plan as a buzzword, although they had no idea what it meant. Yeah. And then they would start telling you they hated it, but they still had never tried it. You know, so we did a few things to try to deal with that dilution of understanding of what inner source is, and one of them was producing these things. So I did the first one almost 2 years ago, but the community has been working through the other 4, and we just filmed the last one, and now we're working on the comprehension questions. So there's a set of trainings that are generic but pretty deep that anybody can get for free. And they live at Inner Source Commons, but it's a richer experience if you go to Safari at O'Reilly because it's all kind of integrated. Yeah. Feels more like a corporate training instead of watching individual little bits, you know. And that's pretty exciting.
And of course there's your PayPal book as well.
Oh, right, I wrote a book with Klaus Stoll, Klaus Jan Stoll, who is a researcher at University of Limerick, He works now actually as a professor for University College Cork in the CS department. But he's published more papers about inner source than anybody. He'd been doing it for a while before I met him. And when I started talking about inner source in 2015 and that hit the wires, they were super excited because they'd written all these papers and nobody was reading them, you know. And so the idea there was create enough case studies that you could, as a company, find yourself and take this book that had a little bit of theory at the beginning, a little bit of practical advice at the end, and a bunch of stories about companies in the middle. You could take it to your boss and say, I think we're like this company, can we try this? You know, so that was the idea. And we have a couple more ideas of books that need to happen. We're still collecting case studies, Klaus and I, to do an expanded version. There's one we weren't able to get permission from the copyright holder or the trademark holder of the company involved, but it's such a good story about ground up implementation of inner source that we're all so hoping we can still get permission for that one. So we want to add to that and add to the book. We've got 3 or 4 other companies that have surfaced since then that have really good stories that don't cover something that's already been covered. So they're archetypes. It's not that there can't be 6 companies doing the same thing. It's just we can only pick one to talk about. So.
Yeah. So finally, if people want to get involved with the Inner Source Commons, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, if they go to innersourcecommons.org and ask for a Slack account, they will immediately be part of the conversation. And then they can look for, if you're just on the general main board, it's not a whole lot of traffic. But as soon as you get involved in one of the committees, one of the work areas, then there's a lot to learn. There's some people who've done successful inner source projects that are part of the leadership. So we've got a board now, and they're all people that have been involved in really famous projects. And everybody's super generous with their information and their time. And then there's companies like NearForm that are, pouring help into this effort. Yeah. We're starting to see more of that, so we're having less and less trouble coming up with sponsors for our summits. I'm about to do one in India, the very first Inner Source Summit Asia in January, and I've already got 4, really good sponsors. So that's great to see. Yeah. People are starting. I mean, we hear about Inner Source everywhere now, which is really exciting. So I figure I've got about 5 more years of working on pushing this out. So about half the time I spend on open source will be spent on inner source. And then I'm trying to set it up so that I can sort of fade away and the thing will keep moving on its own. So
that is really interesting. Thank you so much for your time, Denise. This has been a really great conversation.
Oh, you're sure welcome. Nice to speak to you.